Okay, so maybe you guys saw my original video that went out on the main channel, but there was some news that Dave Meltzer had reported where the talks between AEW and Fox have fallen apart, and that's why we have not seen an announcement for AEW Shockwave. And obviously, this has caused a very interesting conversation on social media. I'm going to tell you guys why I don't think Shockwave will happen anytime soon, why it may never happen at all, and why it's not actually a bad thing at all, because I think a lot of times people think, oh, well, Rampage was just canceled, and oh, well, talks between AEW and Fox have fallen apart and nobody wants to work with AEW. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Now, there is one thing that has to be said. If companies don't want a third AEW show, that's not necessarily a bad sign for AEW, but what it could really mean is that people understand that this show will not be the same level of there won't be the same level of emphasis on this show as there would be on like a Dynamite, for example, which is AEW's flagship show. That is the reason why AEW got paid such a large sum of money from Warner Bros. Discovery, because they have the rights, the exclusive rights in America to broadcast the flagship show for AEW. Now, you got to remember that AEW Shockwave is essentially a third show for AEW. Maybe even a fourth show if Rampage were to somewhat come back in 2025. But you have to remember, AEW has kind of shown their failures when it comes to AEW Rampage. And I think that was an indicator to a lot of companies that like Rampage was just extra content that didn't have much value. And because it didn't have much value, I think some companies could be turned off from that, right? And that's the issue, right? I think what we have seen, and WWE is actually the perfect example of this. WWE Main Event, WWE Superstars. Those shows are not desired shows. There's very little emphasis on those shows. They're pre-taped shows, right? Those were the type of shows that like WWE just did to provide additional content, but they didn't really have any meaning. If you go back to the original first few episodes of WWE Superstars, you would think that it would be a big deal, but then it never actually amounted to anything. And that's kind of what happened with Rampage. And I think that's kind of the issue with AEW trying to shop around Shockwave. Now, AEW Shockwave, to be clear, was rumored to be a 1-hour show going to Fox. And I think what often happens is people look at this as like a very, very, very bad thing. But if AEW implements another 1-hour show to their lineup when their initial 1-hour show was very unsuccessful, it's not that intriguing for people to purchase. Now, let's just be clear here. If AEW was shopping Dynamite, I think Fox would have had a lot more interest in there. But the fact that AEW already has those TV rights figured, I don't think Shockwave is that much more of an attractive piece to the library for some other company. Now, if Shockwave were to become a 2-hour show and were to be considered the secondary show for AEW, in which you would see all of its top stars on that show, then yeah, I think you would see Shockwave, and I think more companies, more TV networks would have bit at that opportunity. But I think it is very clear that Shockwave being a 1-hour show is essentially just another Rampage. And I don't think that is an attractive piece of content for any TV provider. Now, the reason why I don't think it's a bad thing is because for AEW, I think one of the biggest issues the company has faced basically since its inception is biting off more than they can chew. And I don't think they need to. I think when AEW tries to do too much at once, I think you can very much tell on the product that there's inconsistencies. And I think sometimes companies try to expand and grow at a rate that is far quicker than they are ready to do. And AEW doesn't need to do that. AEW has already established a massive relationship with Warner Bros. Discovery that everything else is just extra at this point. Now, I know there's going to be a lot of people in the comments that try to argue this point, but the reality is AEW got the largest TV deal outside of any wrestling company that's not WWE. So like that right there is already a significant achievement. We could talk about their creative and their booking all day, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. The numbers, they tell the most convincing point possible. So for me, I don't look at Shockwave not being launched as a failure. I don't even look at it as a bad thing. I look at Shockwave, if it does get a TV deal, I look at it as a huge win for professional wrestling, not a huge win for AEW. because ultimately I don't think another show for AEW does anything to improve AEW. I don't think it helps AEW in the slightest. All it is additional content. Just like if WWE were to lose main event right now, I don't think it would matter in the slightest, right? They just lost NXT Level Up. I don't think that hurts WWE in the slightest. I don't think it impacts them or affects them in the slightest. So for me, it's a little bit different, right? And I think these kind of conversations had to be had because I do like the idea of more wrestling shows popping up on various TV networks. I think that's just awesome for the wrestling industry, but sometimes it just isn't necessarily needed. Now, here's what I would like to see. I would like to see AEW and Fox actually have a partnership for a new TV show. And I would like to see Fox do what they did with WWE Backstage and implement something similar to AEW. It's not going to have the highest ratings. It's not going to be anything like that. But what it will allow is AEW and Fox to have a relationship. And the reason why I think AEW and Fox having a relationship could be beneficial is because it does show other wrestling companies and it shows everybody that they can also have a relationship with large TV networks, not just WWE, right? It's one thing to have one big TV deal, but if you can have a relationship and a TV deal with another large network, that is great. So even if they don't launch Shockwave, but they were to launch like a behind the scenes or like an analysis show, that took a second to spit out. But if they had like some sort of show where there was analysis and it was talking about the AEW product, or maybe even better, because AEW has relationships obviously with Stardom and New Japan and CMLL. If Fox were to have a show, late night show, 1 hour long, where it kind of shows you the highlights of what's been happening between AEW and those other properties, and you have wrestlers on there as guests and they talk about stuff and you push stories forward and stuff, that would be really unique. That would be really cool. That is something I think would actually be a lot better than having another 1 hour show of wrestling to follow. I don't think AEW has been successful with the 1 hour show. I can argue that their 2 hour shows are better. And I know for a fact people will disagree with me here, and I'm totally okay with accepting that. But I am one of the few people that thinks Dynamite would benefit from being 3 hours long versus 2. So instead of having AEW Shockwave for 1 hour, I would just add 1 hour to Dynamite and then have like some sort of analysis show on Fox or some other TV deal partner. Something like WWE Backstage could be really cool for AEW, especially because they are more of that sports approach. I know they got rid of the records and like the win-loss in the rankings and stuff. But maybe if they could find a way to implement that back in 2025, and then you could have a breakdown on Fox, that would be really dope as well. And I think for AEW, it could be a really cool thing for their future of the company just by having that relationship with Fox. It doesn't need to be anything insane. So I don't think it's ever going to happen. I don't think we're going to get Shockwave. Maybe it happens, but I'm going to say based on what we saw with Rampage, I don't think it'll be as successful as people would like it to be. And I think Dave Meltzer made a really good point. AEW's numbers aren't that strong, not a big deal. But that could be a reason why some potential TV partners are reluctant to spending money on them. And that is completely fine because AEW, all they have to do is just figure it out. And once they figure it out, the demand will be there. That's how it is with any other business. So it's no different than pro wrestling.